Hello, everybody. This is Paul Tinkle on this week's 30 Minutes program. My guest today, Rick Hatler, former University of Tennessee Martin Chief of Police and former Public Safety Director for Martin, Tennessee, is J.D. Sanders. We're going to be talking about terrorism and other things, crime, all of that right now. J.D., take it up first.
It can be both. In this country, the thing that's always given me pause is how vulnerable that we are on the small things, the small towns like Martin, and the lack of resources that we would have in a community this size. Should we have one of those big things like they have in maybe the major cities? But then it can be a big thing. With today, how the world has changed so much since September 11th, and capabilities of people to commit acts of terrorism it's unbelievable how far it's gone, and the threats that are really out there with the capability of carrying out those threats.
Rick, tell me more.
I think, Paul, that the key of terrorism that we have problems understanding sometimes is, as opposed to traditional crime, the motivation for terrorism is altogether different. Usually if you look at crime in the United States, you have usually a profit motive or some kind of a rage at a marital spouse or whatever. But if we look at terrorism is motivated by the desire to intimidate the government or a group of people or some segment of that government in order to get that government to do certain things that the person apparently does not agree with. And so in looking at terrorism, one reason it's hard for us to understand it is I think we are not deep enough in our communities on looking at the motivators behind that. If we talk about traditional crime, then J.D.'s been in law enforcement for a long time. He can talk to you about motivators for traditional crime, but there are so many triggers that can set off some kind of terrorist act that's hard for us to get our arms around that sometimes.
Mm-hmm. You two come from different walks and a little bit different in age, not much, but you folks have seen a lot of things in your career being a law person, a lawman. Tell me how you got into law enforcement.
Well, I was very fortunate going to school at UT Martin, and UT Martin had they started the criminal justice degree back about the time I was going to school in 1970. I was the first graduate from UT Martin, degree in criminal justice, and I wanted to look for, quite frankly, I was looking for the challenge. I like to help people, but I also wanted to get involved in a job that would make a difference in the community. And so I found that in the Dallas Police Department. And I worked with Dallas, retired from Dallas, and I worked a couple of more jobs. But I worked in law enforcement at the local, state, national, and international level. And I've very much enjoyed my entire career. And I like to think that I've helped some people along the way. I know it's certainly been an interesting trip.
But you haven't done all of it right here. You've been in other places besides Texas.
Yeah, I was a police officer in Texas, and then in Missouri, then here in Tennessee. And then for a 10-year period of time, I worked with the Department of Justice, first as a contractor and then as a permanent employee, and working overseas. And I worked in a group that was called is a response group out of Washington, D.C., made up of about 120 people from 8 different departments, that we would go into post-conflict environments and try to work to address every aspect of a new government or recovering society in order to make it more of a democratic type society in those countries. And so I did some work in the Middle East and Africa and Southeast Europe and some of those places.
And then you came home and became the police chief here at UT Martin?
No, I retired. I was the police chief of the university from, 2000, 2006, overseas from 2006 to 2016.
So you saw a lot of things you never would have seen had you not left here.
Most assuredly.
Mm-hmm.
Most assuredly.
Mm-hmm. J.D., how did you get in law enforcement?
I backed into it. My dad was a police chief in Troy, but I had absolutely no aspirations at all to be in law enforcement. And in 1980, the economy was so bad, we couldn't find a job. And I thought if I was going to starve to death, I might as well do it going to college. So I entered late into college in 1980. I'd already been out of high school for 7 years, and entered the criminal justice program at UT that Rick was the pioneer of, and looked at it with my goal at that time was to be with the TBI. I don't know why, but that's the early goal that I had. And I had 4 kids, and I had to work my way through college, so I had to get a job, and I got a job starting at UT Martin, as dispatcher first, and then as a patrol officer, and an opportunity came available at the city of Martin in '84, and Chief Jackie Moore hired me to come on there. It was a little bit of a pay increase for me, and it still allowed me to go to college. Jackie encouraged that. And then I finished, worked 20 years with Martin, was appointed police chief in 95. And then in 99, was appointed director of public safety when Chief Buster Williams retired from the fire department. In 2000, strangely enough, Phil Dane, the late Phil Dane, good friend of mine, miss him. He asked me to serve on the search committee to fill the position at UT Martin for the police chief. And we had a couple of committee meetings, and resume of Rick Hatler come across the desk, and Phil, during the break, come over to me. He said, what do you think about Rick Hatler? And I said, if you can get Rick Hatler, you don't need to waste any more time with the search and the resources here. You hire Rick Hatler. And he said, I agree. I think that's what we're going to do. So Rick came on board, and we worked very well together. I learned a lot from him. He brought a lot of experience and know-how from Dallas here, and from the department in Missouri. And then I was approached by a recruiter to go to Columbus, Mississippi. I went there for 3 years as police chief. From there to Franklin, Tennessee, and served a year back under Jackie again as deputy chief there. And then that recruiter called me about a position in Hobbs, New Mexico. So I went to Hobbs for 5 years as police chief, and intended to retire when I finished at Hobbs. But that same recruiter called me and said, I've got this perfect opportunity for you in a place called Memorial Villages in Houston, Texas. And I went down there to really just out of curiosity, and fell absolutely in love with it. It was Memorial Villages was made up of 6 small communities, about 3,000, 4,000 population each. They incorporated in the early 50s to keep Houston from taking them into or annexing them. And so over the years, Houston completely enveloped them and grew around them. Our city limits was Houston each direction. But it was a unique community, very wealthy. You mentioned yesterday the wealthiest cities in the United States. I think Belle Meade was the one in Tennessee, but historically, each year they kind of swap places, the villages and Memorial Villages, of being on that list. As a matter of fact, the zip code there, I think, is the richest zip code at one time in the country. So, Memorial Villages was where I finally retired and come back full circle back to Troy, where I was raised, and now raise donkeys.
If you just joined us, we have Rick Hatler in the studio with us today, and J.D. Sanders. Both have been longtime lawmen. So what's happened to our society? Rick, this is a different world than it was a few years ago when you were here at UT Martin and when J.D. was here.
You know, Paul, I think that we have to go back to the founding of the country. And I think our founding fathers put together rules and regulations, things we call a constitution, that they expect us to follow. And I think the rules and regulations for society, that our society for a long time is willing to follow those. I think we come to a point that our society is not so willing to blindly follow all the rules and regulations and things that come into play. I think this also comes into play oftentimes if we look at the issues that develop terrorist-type individuals. Oftentimes when we look at terrorism, we look at it and we try to think about terrorism as a huge monster that's not going to affect us that much. But in my study of terrorism and the people that I've known have been involved in it, those folks who get involved in terrorism are often not that much different from people who become involved in gangs in the United States, if you look at their backgrounds. And so everywhere in the United States, we look at gangs primarily in terrorism as a major city type issue, but it's something that started to spread out and it's starting to just come around. But I think I think our society as a whole, Paul, for a number of reasons, are less likely to accept the order that our founding fathers established for us.
We have a different time now because all of the mechanical devices, we'll call it, and we'll say what it is. I mean, everybody's got a phone, and it's easy to say, I'm going to tell them that there is a bomb in that school 500 miles away, about blowing up a school or shooting someone.
We learned last week that they don't have to be 20 miles down the road. They were getting hoaxes and SWAT calls and all those kinds of things in Springfield, Ohio, after that rhubarb with up there with the politics, and they were getting threats. And when they tracked them down, I think they had 34 of them. They were all from overseas, all generated overseas. So you don't know where it's coming from, and you don't know who's on the other side of that threat, whether it's a kid that's goofing off and just trying to have fun or show out, or if it's somebody that really means business. And usually the ones that I think Rick will agree with this, the ones that means business is not usually the ones that call in those threats. They don't want anybody to know what they're doing or to give them any warning of what they're doing. Those bad guys are going to do it without warning, or try to do it without warning. There, the secrecy of it is their whole thing. But just again using the benchmark of time, and going back to September the 11th. In that little 20-year span, look at the difference that we have in the ability to communicate. You're talking about cell phones. Most people get their news now. What they get of news is from social media, from that phone or from their computer at home. A lot of that is false. A lot of it is AI generated, artificial intelligence, which is a thing that scares me half to death coming up. So it doesn't have to be that person anymore. It can be, the artificial intelligence generated. But, in hitting on what Rick said, just a little bit of how people are reacting to norms, and we're not like we used to be. Cause, when Rick and I grew up, and you, Paul, we sit around the supper table and then watch 6 o'clock news, and that's where we got our news, or the morning newspaper. Now, gosh almighty, you can get it from a zillion different places, and you can't trust hardly any of it.
Let's go back here for something that both of you have spent time on the campus here at UT Martin. That's a lot of people there, and and a lot of different people come from a lot of different walks.
Oh, that's true, Paul. And I think we can have virtually anything that happen at the university that can happen in society at large. So let's keep it in mind. We pull these students from society at large. That's one thing this university is very concerned about, has been for a long time, on ensuring the safety and security of the people out there who are going to school, the teachers, etc. And they have a pretty good support system out there. They have a pretty good system that they can react to if they receive information of some kind of pending disorder or unlawful activity that might occur. And I think that's where one thing that is so critical, and I'm sure that J.D. would agree, the flow of information and the ability to train our communities, whether it's the university community or community more at large, to train our community what to be aware of, what to look out for, to note changes in behavior and things of that nature. Because virtually every situation, if you look at multiple shooter situations or some of the situations that have occurred recently, oftentimes we will find, if we go back and look at their background good enough, we'll find triggers that are going to set those people off. We're going to find some kind of action they took that, if we knew, was most likely a predictor of some kind of behavior, the predictor of some kind of behavior that would be inappropriate behavior. But it's a matter of knowing and putting the information together.
Were you worried during the time? Were you a little bit uncomfortable knowing all of the things that have been taking place, particularly? Let's go back to 9/11 for a moment.
We like to think we're isolated from the 9/11 situation here in Martin, Tennessee.
Not so.
Not so. There are connections that have taken place. Now, while there are no direct situations involved in Martin, Tennessee that impacted the 9/11 situation, we did have inquiries from law enforcement about individuals who were in the community or were going to school, and because they were in circumstances that were fairly consistent with the circumstances of some of the people who were involved in this activity as far as air traffic, things like that go. Now, nobody here was involved in anything, and subsequent investigations prove that up. But oftentimes, it's very small things, out of the way things that might occur that can be the predictors of some kind of bigger activities. People come back and talk about the intelligence information that was available for 9/11 and whether federal law enforcement should have tied it all together. I think people have no understanding of the magnitude of the intelligence information that the federal government has and the ability to tie those things together. And you mentioned technology. Technology has done a tremendous, and technology's come a long way in the last 22 years. Technology can go a long way in assisting law enforcement in tying together different indicators or clues that give us an idea of who's associated with who or what kind of activities people are involved in that might be indicative of some kind of terrorism type behaviors.
J.D., I think it's pretty clear that most people think that terrorism, things that are really, really bad, are done by people that are not from here, but not necessarily. We have people that are shooting in supermarkets and killing people out here on the highway on Interstate 75, I guess it was, not long ago, where you had somebody from that area in Kentucky and shooting at cars that go by. And that's a terrorism issue. Would you not call that?
I think it is. And, we identified that here in Martin a long time ago, back in 96, 97, and recognized that the most vulnerable place that we had, along with the University of Tennessee was not as vulnerable because they had their own police department and that kind of thing. But the place that was vulnerable was our local schools. And in Martin, in 96, 97, we started placing school resource officers in schools then. That was 25 years before anybody else around here was doing it. And I firmly believe we don't have the technology capabilities to find every threat, because just like the guy you talk about in Kentucky, what did he do? Snap one day? Maybe he could give some indications that he was going to do something like that. But sometimes it's just somebody that one day kind of took it all they wanted to take and decided that, they were going to do something terrible. So we knew that we felt like that if we put a police officer in those schools, that we may not be able to stop the threats external from the school, but we could stop him from coming in that school.
Well, now we got all schools are locked down every day to protect teachers.
Well, sadly, they're not. They say they are, but they're not. And I wish they were, but they're not. They're still, I can get in any school I want to around here, and I shouldn't be able to, because I think, Paul, the greatest threat that we have is complacency. How quickly we forget. How quickly we think that won't happen here, and we put ourselves in that little safety bubble, and maybe it won't. Maybe it will never happen here, but it can just as easy as it can on a rural highway in eastern Kentucky. Short of being able to have a crystal ball and predict when these things are going to happen, you got to have that component. You got to be able to have the intelligence and have that component, but you're still not going to stop everything. I think Rick will agree with this. In the security world, whether it's federal, state, local, whatever, we have to be right at 100% of the time.
I don't want to get too deep into this without asking you this one question, and that is, how do you feel when you look at the television, when you hear about mass shootings? 430 mass shootings at the time that we are recording this program. And you folks are out of business. I mean, you still care greatly about your home communities. Rick?
Quite frankly, Paul, it infuriates me. It doesn't make me afraid, but I'm afraid for my children and grandchildren. What's going to happen if these changes continue? But it absolutely infuriates me to see these kind of things, these kind of things that occur. You mentioned a lot of technology a while ago, Paul, and I think what we don't think about sometimes is this goes true. This had been true for J.D. and myself's career, entire career. Criminals and terrorists are not dummies. They are smart. Anything that's invented for the good of society, if a person wants to, they can turn it to the detriment of society. And therefore, it's important for those folks who are determined to use that technology in the right way, to be creative and think about how could this be subverted, because somebody is going to subvert just about anything we have in society, whether it's technology or laws. Somebody's going to find a way to subvert it. And so we need to accept the fact that technology is going to be abused. Technology is going to be used for terrorism. And number one, how do we prevent it? And number two, how do we find out about it and respond to it? And I think oftentimes we don't think sometimes. We are not imaginative enough sometimes on how we go about preventing some of these problems that occur, especially with some of the technology around today.
I'm going to ask both of you, what was the worst situation you've had to deal with in your careers?
My worst situation is the death of officers who work for me. That's by far the worst thing. Now, I've worked killings where you have 5, 6, 7 people killed. Overseas, more than that, 30 or 40 or 50. But probably to me personally, the roughest thing was the death of police officers who I knew.
J.D.?
I would have to agree. There's a lot of rough things. It doesn't have to be 40 people, killed in a supermarket to be horrible. There's a lot, just a world of horrible. A lot of little things add up too. Over a period of time.
The world that we all live in here is a little bit more uncomfortable for most people because we have so many immigrants that have been coming across the border for years now. And at this juncture, that the concern seems to be the same with everybody, is I don't want them living here near me, or I'm scared of those people, or they live next door and I don't know who they are. And you want to take that, J.D.?
Well, let me share this with you. Back when I first started with Martin as a patrol officer, and this was before Rick came back to UT Martin, so we're talking about in the late 80s, we had situations that would come up with UT Martin of what you were talking about a while ago, Rick, about people being drawn from all other places that came here. The bad guy of the day back then was Gaddafi in Libya. And we had domestic calls and situational calls in apartments and things across Martin. And we go in and be a picture of the guy that's living there with full military with a automatic rifle strapped around his shoulder and a picture of Gaddafi on the wall. Well, that's a threat to me. That guy is from a doctrine of danger. Mm-hmm. I'll share this with you. I couldn't share it for years, but I can now. We actually had a guy that the FBI was had alerted us to, brought us a picture, asked us if we'd ever seen this guy before, and we had seen him here in Martin, and this guy was a terrorist from China. He come in the West Coast. They tracked him. He come in the West Coast and into Washington, and he crisscrossed all across the United States. They were able to document things that are places that he'd been, and then they found him several days later asleep in a car in a rest area up in Maryland, and he was going to the World Trade or Times Square to set off a bomb. He had all the mechanisms and stuff, and guess where he got them? Along that way. Bought some stuff from a hardware store right here in Martin. This was a bad guy. Mm-hmm. And it's pretty good cover for him to come into college town because you don't pay attention as much to a person from another country in a college town.
Rick Hatler?
Paul, I see a lot on the news, and I have personal opinions about the situation with the immigrants and coming into the country. I think we're missing the point. I think, and J.D. I think he would agree, he might disagree. I think the greatest threat to people right here in Weakley County and in Martin, Tennessee, are local folks who commit acts who may be terrorism, such as threatening the schools, or such as somebody walks into a place, a public shooting type situation. We got our own local folks to take care of, keep an eye on. I think sometimes while we're focusing on what we have been perceived as the maddening hordes crossing the border, sometimes we look at the forest, don't see the trees. We need to take a look at the trees in our own community. We need to look at our own children. We need to support our school system and what they're trying to do with young folks. We need to support our police by flowing information. But we can do something right here at home. I can't do anything to stop a bombing in New York City, but I can do something about Weakley County, and I can do it about Martin, Tennessee. And that's where I think our focus should be.
J.D.?
Well, you have to be diligent, too, because it may not be something that happens, necessarily here. But if you'll stop and think about it, it was local folks that caught Timothy McVeigh. It wasn't the feds. After his deal, he was stopped on the highway by a highway patrolman for speeding. Might have got away. The guy that just did the second assassination attempt on Trump, the way he was caught was a nosy woman took a picture of his car and thought he may be in Mexico right now. We may not ever know that. I could talk a long time on the failures, I think, of some of our federal agencies right now today, not just the Secret Service, but the FBI and a lot of, they do a lot of really good things, but man, they do a lot of stuff. It just makes me scratch my head too, wondering what in the heck they were thinking. I'll give you an example. I think y'all are probably familiar with where Mar-a-Lago is, where President Trump lives, and the golf course that he was, that's close to where his residence is. And this guy is patient. That's one thing about bad guys. They're patient. He stalked that area for days and days and days. They pinged his phone. He was all over the place. I can tell you right now, if he had been in Memorial Villages, Texas, he wouldn't have lasted 2 days there before he'd been on our radar. And why? We had LPRs at every entrance coming and going from that community. We put them in 9 years ago, and every single car that comes into that town it reads their license plate, and if it's a license plate that's wanted, it pings us automatically. But we got the ability to go back and look through our computer data that we gather from that and see if a certain license plate starts showing up at odd places at odd times of the day, to make us then put him in our trigger that if he hits one of those LPRs, our guys are going to go check him out and see what he's up to. I can't tell you how many people they've caught in Memorial Villages because of license plate readers. They don't have license plate readers around Mar-a-Lago, where the president's at, the former president's at, almost all the time. It just defies common sense. I don't know why in the world they don't do things like that.
I hope our program today has given you folks at least some look into the ball here, and to be able to say, okay, I'm looking at the crystal ball. I've heard these two fellows who have said that there are things that can be done. And particularly what both of you feel, and that is, you have to take care of your people at the house. You got to be somebody to step up and make the phone call. A 911 call may be the difference, or just a phone call to somebody.
Well, you never know, Paul. It could be the missing puzzle that Rick's been looking for, sitting there at UT Martin. He may be trying to put together something, and that one little insignificant seeming fact may be the key to the puzzle of putting together something that he knows that he needed help on.
Thanks so much, gentlemen, for coming in. I really appreciate you, Rick Hatler and J.D. Sanders. Y'all have spent your life in one thing, and that is trying to take care of people, keep them safe, and to keep our country safe. And I thank you very much for doing that.
Thank you, Paul.
Yeah, I appreciate it.
That's our program today here on 30 Minutes. Thanks, everybody, for listening.
You've been listening to 30 Minutes, a community affairs program on Thunderbolt Radio. You can listen to this broadcast and others anytime by visiting thunderboltradio.com and following the Thunderbolt Radio and Digital YouTube page. Thanks for listening.